Kieran Anderson, group publisher here at Applied Radiology, and we're here at RSNA 2023. I've got the pleasure of having Ryan Terry in our booth today. Ryan is the Managing Director of Healthcare and Life Sciences at Google Cloud. Ryan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
The role in this migration to the cloud is ongoing, obviously, right? And everybody here is looking at different ways to do that. I'd love to talk to you today a little bit about Google's role in that migration and what that means in healthcare today. Why now, right? And how are they going to get there?
Certainly. Well, why now is a very interesting question. There's a couple of big drivers we see since COVID, as things started to accelerate with technology and healthcare. The barriers for data use have also collapsed within organizations. So thinking horizontally in the whole ecosystem of information and how it can help accelerate care transformation, as well as a big drive to collapse cost. So from a Google perspective, we look to help collapse costs and help people get sustainability and how they go to market and how they think differently about how they advance care.
That certainly makes sense, and it probably segues into, what are some of those challenges and what are some of those next steps as people go on this journey, right? I mean, so many people are worried about how do they trust that patient data up in the cloud? Everybody's concerned about that. How do you manage that leap of faith that these organizations are going to have to take with you? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I think it is definitely a very valid question. Someone should always ask how the information is used, how it's secured, how are they thinking about the ecosystem and the use of that information. A lot of it's culture, though. A lot of it's understanding that the data has a purpose and how do we make that data more useful, how do we make that data proactive in how we deliver care. So taking a methodical approach and thinking about it from a how do we start, how do we gradually work our way in a sustainable way that gets us to outcomes both long-term as well as short-term, helps bridge that gap for most organizations.
Right. When you think about what are some of the components these healthcare leaders today and their teams, right? Because this is, no one person is doing this, right? What do they have to consider when moving to the cloud? What are some of the more important things that they should be asking you and their vendors that they're working with as they go on this journey?
I'm going to go back to culture a little bit on this because a lot of it really comes down to how do you leave your predispositions at the door when you walk into the discussion? Looking at historical decisions and things organizations have made sometimes can be a barrier to how they transform because they feel bound by legacy. And cloud is really about transforming from legacy to advancing to the future. So taking that leap of faith to say we can innovate, we can think differently, we can not necessarily hold ourselves to historical decisions, but now think of how they set a foundation for us to advance is really a major factor in how most organizations have made successful leaps versus those organizations who have struggled with cloud and seen it as a barrier for them, either from a cost perspective or a growth perspective, is often not tied to their cloud strategy. It's tied to their desire to stay in their historical decisions.
Right. It's funny that you mentioned that because, you think about those historical decisions, how people did things, and obviously everybody wanted to store everything on site, on premise, right? Now there's this shift, What do you feel like the impact to imaging is going to, what is that impact that people are going to see as they sort of move from on-premise to the cloud? How does that affect them?
I think there's kind of a few main components. One is cloud gives you the opportunity to collapse some of your costs for how you maintain that information. And two is that ecosystem of information that sits around the image itself now gives contextual information outside of the image itself, but also cloud, because of its scale, gives you the ability to look at historical images, as well as the data and the analytics around that information tied to that image and other ancillary images which have similar characteristics to help give a more holistic picture to that caregiver when they're making that decision.
When you think about some of the key components that healthcare leaders today are having to consider as they begin this migration to move towards the cloud, in your opinion, what should they be asking? And maybe what are they not asking, when they think about this journey to the cloud?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that's important is that think multi-cloud. Think the capability of horizontal versus maybe verticalized. How does that help me get sustainability and how I invest over time? Realistically, within 12 to 18 months, any cloud investment should be a sustainable investment, whether through cost avoidance or benefit analysis. And that's really important to consider as you think about the structure of how you do it. But one of the most important components is what culture am I trying to build within my organization? Do I want to create a culture of innovation? Do I want to create a culture of growth within my organization? And that's really fundamental, kind of core combination of questions. when you think about that transition to cloud.
Yeah, no, that makes an awful lot of sense. Thank you for addressing that. And as we start thinking about why should imaging organizations move to the cloud now, right? And this is kind of where we started this conversation. But really, what is the impact if they wait and don't get started now? Your thoughts there?
Absolutely. So we are already starting to see some of the impact from this. When you think about innovation and organizations that attract the most skilled, the most highly regarded physician groups, the most scale across the organizations, why not move? Why not think about how do I want to iterate? And it doesn't happen overnight. So a lot of the data needs to be transitioned into a manner that can be leveraged at scale, that can be leveraged across cloud infrastructures. But also it's one of those things where if I want to get in a cost perspective that gives me the ability to use my data in a new way, why wait? You're really at a disadvantage if you wait because you're not getting the scale and capacity associated with all the benefits of that larger ecosystem of information now being brought into a new dynamic of care.
And as you think about why, right? Why should they move all of this imaging to the cloud? What does that impact? Is it better efficiency, better workflow, allow people to work remotely? People are moving, right?
Yes.
Your patients were in one city in November and they're somewhere else in, later in the year. What are your thoughts there?
I think it's kind of a combination of all the above. So we're seeing a drive for smaller systems also being able to leverage some of the capacity and scale of larger systems, as well as not just your kind of urban centers, but your rural communities being able to leverage access to information through the cloud at a more cost-effective manner.
Right.
So they don't necessarily have to have a specialty at every single location. They could extend their infrastructure and their capacity for people. I think it's also taking and moving that care of that image forward in the process, because earlier diagnoses is coming out. It's making this role of the imaging also, it's always been relevant, it's always been very important, but now that ancillary data is actually pulling it forward in the diagnosis process to see earlier things that images may not be showing, but information characteristics are making that image more relevant earlier on in the process.
I think that's such an important point, because at the end of the day, it's really what can they expect from all of this? How is this going to change, their lives on a daily basis? So maybe as you think about some of what you've just said there, are there anything else? You'd mentioned culture makes a difference and you mentioned the smaller systems, but is there anything else they can expect in terms of results?
Absolutely. I think, speed and access to information is really important. So, traditional read time can reduce when you start to have that ancillary information and get to earlier diagnoses on those reads. Also, the sheer volume of information to narrow down and help give perspective looks at that information. You can expect those to be, more reads available, more reads possible because of the ability that cloud gives you to disperse those reads across a large footprint of physicians.
And you think about case examples of, maybe not getting into specific names of customers, but those that have made the migration successfully. What kind of successes have you seen? What kind of results that, maybe we've talked about, maybe we haven't talked about, have you seen as they go through this journey?
Well, it's also really important to note this is not a replacement for the process or a replacement for the reads. It's additional support. So looking at things like earlier diagnoses of where a historical read may be in a 50 to 60% accuracy, it actually pulls that to maybe a 90% accuracy earlier in the process. So that is really enhancing that overall quality of care, and it's going to the mission of not treating the disease post, but actually earlier diagnoses so they can proactively treat it before it starts to accelerate. We're seeing a lot of that in things like breast cancer, early identification. We're seeing that in brain, a lot of brain utilization as well. When you start to think about Alzheimer's and earlier onset of Alzheimer's, we're seeing a lot of those ancillary types of information contribute to pulling that treatment plan much faster or forward in the process.
That really is where the rubber meets the road, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that's great. Let's talk a little bit about differentiation and where do you see differentiation, say with Optum as an organization, for example, who I know Google Cloud has partnered with.
Yeah, yes. So Optum, as part of the broader ecosystem, has done what I talked about kind of at the start, which is break down those barriers to their information. So thinking holistically about how that one particular patient relates to their total population. They've done that legwork to understand how to make that data more readily accessible as part of that artificial intelligence ecosystem they've built. To pull that, again, back to the premise of pulling the information forward, so in the treatment plan it becomes that much more effective earlier on. Optum has taken those steps. They're ahead of the game with respect to how they're starting to make the difference.
Can you give some take-home points that our audience might be able to really, digest on why the cloud might be more desirable than an on-site, on-premise solution?
I think one of the most relevant things is the way you approach cloud can be incremental. So if you look at large capital acquisitions, often they have multi-year heavy burdens that can strap an organization from a cost perspective. Cloud gives you the flexibility to incrementally scale your business in. So you can always evaluate and look at cost-benefit analysis as well as outcomes in each investment you make without having to think about how am I going to replace this infrastructure, how am I going to look at this capital investment over time. It actually gives you that phased process so you can monitor and manage your cost, your return, and how your organization transitions throughout the life cycle of that agreement and that relationship as well.
Right, I can't think of a better way to kind of segue into what this might mean for sort of the ecosystem of imaging, because as you know, today we have a diverse group of organizations. You've got large academic centers, teaching centers, you have community hospitals, you have outpatient imaging centers, and in some cases all of them are probably going to need to be thinking about this. Yeah. When you think about that, how have you seen this data kind of like impact these different imaging ecosystems, and maybe some examples if you can share?
Sure. So I think one of the biggest things is remote reads. And the time to collapse to actually get that done through uploading those from maybe some of the smaller entities, remote imaging centers, to kind of a core where you have the bulk of maybe your largest radiologist pool, where you can get capacity, where sometimes you can help collapse the amount of time it gets to return, which also improves that patient experience, right? That is a really important focus. It always comes back to the patient. And the cloud actually is helping enable that through collapsing that time and giving those tools to those radiologists so they can turn that around faster, so they can make that experience just that much quicker to get that answer to that burning question that everybody says, is my read going to be good, or am I going to have an issue in this? And this is actually facilitating some of that support for that transition.
Do you think in a way that it helps, I don't want to use equalize is not the right way to put it, but you've got these smaller, say even rural hospitals, right? You mentioned, that subspecialty and that access to subspecialty where they may not have certain subspecialists on staff. Does this give them a chance to compete with some of the larger, healthcare organizations, maybe 50 miles away, 100 miles away?
It does, and it also really helps to collapse some of the divide. The digital divide and access to quality healthcare. The cloud really is helping support narrowing that field, that gap, that margin, to facilitate that. This is a global problem, and it's one that Google's addressing through helping with the cloud to help collapse this overall time value and extension of the skill sets through supporting our partners and supporting the health systems and the caregivers. It's important that we maintain a neutral focus in this, and we're supporting function. So we're never going to be a caregiver. We're never going to do diagnoses. AI doesn't do that. It gives what's called probabilistic math, which gives you narrow margin of error. It reduces that margin of error and helps whatever the spectrum is, the size of the facility, the amount of radiologists the organization have, actually get scale wherever they're at.
When you think about these teams, right, the groups that you're working with who are interested in this journey, can you tell us a little bit about who's included in that group?
Sure.
Of course there's chief information officers and CTOs and things of that nature, but who makes up these teams?
Absolutely. Well, it's really important you have caregivers involved. The end user should understand what they're going to evolve to. At the end of the day, it's about treating their patients. So giving them access and input is really valuable. But I think often we'll see CFOs involved in the process as well, chief medical information officers, and often AI or analytics teams. Because now it's not just storing the information, it's making that information actionable and relevant in a point of time where it can be at the point of care when it's needed.
Right. So you really need a collaborative team who are all working towards a common goal. And I'm sure it's different in every organization, but when you think about, and we've talked about scaling and things like that here, but what is a general time frame? Like if you were to start a conversation, right? Do these institutions, is this a 6-month project? Is this a 12-month project? Maybe just a little thoughts on what they can kind of expect.
I would assume, you should look at 90-day increments and things. There's a combination of things. So think of it like a layer cake. There's longer term projects which are more AI driven or clinical outcome driven that require more analysis. But in the parallel, you can do a lot of incremental things, infrastructure, data, smaller wins along the way that help build a combination of an innovation culture along with sustainable foundation to grow.
When you think about where we're going, right? Like crystal ball, right?
Yeah.
Where's the future of the cloud in all of this? What's on the horizon, a year from now, maybe 5 years from now, if you were to, give us your thoughts on that?
We certainly would love to see as many images in the cloud as possible because of the amount of data that it helps generate to help advance care. At the end of the day, the best is a combination of on-premise as well as cloud, though. We always promote multi-cloud environments. There's different capabilities and skill sets that all organizations have. And as long as organizations take an objective approach and they think about how they're going to incrementally get to sustainability with what they do and how they invest, our goal is to advance care in a cost-effective way so that our hospital systems, so that our small clinics, our remote read capabilities can all level up. To your point, your question earlier about does this level the field? Hopefully, that's the goal, is that all boats rise.
Well, Ryan Terry, Managing Director, Healthcare and Life Science at Google Cloud, I can't thank you again for taking the time to join us here at Applied Radiology.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.